The Ukrainian army was successful in its aim to seize control of the Russian army's important airbase. The Russian army initially captured the Donetsk airbase that blew up. The Ukrainian army's missiles made the Donetsk region's blown-up airbase useless. One single operation was sufficient to completely destroy the airbase that Russian President Vladimir Putin labored over for several months in an attempt to build. The conflict that has raged between Russia and Ukraine for the past 19 months has become increasingly violent on a daily basis. The Ukrainian army has completed an incredible operation by deploying long-range missile systems in the city of Izum in Bakhmut, which is located in one of the areas where combat is most intense. The intensity of the fighting has recently intensified. After months of occupation by Wagner's men, the city of Bakhmut has finally begun to see some beneficial changes. Things became more complicated in Bakhmut after the death of Yevgeny Prigozhin, the leader of Wagner, when Wagner troops began to withdraw from Ukrainian territory. The Ukrainian army concluded that they needed to increase their operations against Bakhmut. The Ukrainian army is seeking to demolish the Russian army's power by organizing 3 distinct ground operations against the Russian defense line in Bakhmut in less than a week. Because of these planned and coordinated ground actions, the Ukrainian army was successful in forcing Russian soldiers out of the village of Bakhmut in Yehidna. Because of its proximity to the city center, Yehidna was regarded as the gateway to Bakhmut in this town. As a result, this town got the moniker the Gateway to Bakhmut. On the other side, Russia's leader, Vladimir Putin, is well aware that if he loses Bakhmut, he will also lose Soledar. As a result, Putin began to coordinate airstrikes to halt the advance of the Ukrainian army, which is still marching on the town of Yehidna. He did this to halt the advance of the Ukrainian army. As soon as the Ukrainian army entered the village of Yehidna, the Kremlin palace was filled with fear. Russian President Vladimir Putin met with senior authorities, including Russian General Valery Gerasimov and Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, among others. Not shortly after this meeting, a Russian airbase established in the Ukrainian city of Donetsk received the order to resume normal operations. Vladimir Putin, the Russian Federation's leader, ordered the aircraft to stop attacking the cities as soon as Russian forces secured control of Bakhmut and Soledar. However, the aircraft and helicopters stationed at the Russian airbase in Donetsk are already operational. Soldiers from the Russian Air Force activated 27 fighter planes to engage in combat under the command of Russian General Valery Gerasimov. The Ukrainian forces stationed here are having a difficult time as a result of the attacks by these jets on the regions of Yehidna town that the Ukrainian army is occupying. The Ukrainian intelligence service, on the other hand, decided to organize Iraq on ascent flights in order to determine the region from which these jets took off and the point of origin. The Ukrainian military conducted surveillance flights in the Donetsk region using unmanned combat aircraft launched from the town of Yehidna. Following these flights, it was confirmed that the Russian airbase was within the municipal limits of Donetsk. The Ukrainian Armed Forces General Valery Zaluzhny issued a command for an immediate assault on this airbase, as well as the continuation of the army's push toward the town of Yehidna. As a result, he was able to speak with leaders of Ukrainian soldiers stationed within the bounds of Donetsk, as is widely known. During the first several months of the battle, the Ukrainian army was successful in freeing the cities of Lyman and Izium from Russian military control. Ukraine's leader, Zelensky, has stationed long-range missile systems in this region to deter any further assaults on the 2 cities he has successfully liberated. Because of the missiles stationed in Izum, the Ukrainian army was able to conduct air operations against the occupying forces in Donetsk with considerable ease. After determining the location of the Russian airbase in Donetsk, the Ukrainian general gave the order to blow up this military base in Izum with missile systems. The coordinates acquired following the reconnaissance flight were sent to the commanders of Ukrainian soldiers stationed in the city of Izum by the Ukrainian intelligence service. Marsa missiles with a long range and high altitude were launched from Izum in response to an order from the Ukrainian commander. Timar missiles, which arrived at the Russian airbase in about 3 minutes, destroyed this 2K, a 52 model combat helicopter, and one Su-27 model fighter plane. At the same time, the missile attack rendered the airfield's runway completely inoperable. The Russian Army's Air Force in Donetsk has suffered a serious hit as a result of this Ukrainian Army organized operation. The Ukrainian Army conducted no air operations in these areas since they were protected by air defense systems stationed in the cities of Bakhmut and Soledar. The military air base in the heart of Donetsk, on the other hand, was a prime target. Vladimir Putin, Russia's president, has requested that air defense systems be deployed in this area in addition to the destruction of this air station. In answer to Vladimir Putin's request, Russian General Valery Gerasimov sent Panzer S-1 model air defense systems to the Donetsk region. Putin, on the other hand, did not make this decision until it was far too late. When the Ukrainian army, which is still stationed in Yehidne, learned that the Russian air base had been destroyed, it began to resume its offensive. When the Ukrainian army discovered that the Russian air base had been neutralized, this transpired. To block the Ukrainian army's progress in this area, Russian President Vladimir Putin was forced to move Russian forces stationed in Soledar to the town of Bakhmut. At Putin's order, some 3,000 Russian troops were dispatched from Soledar in the direction of Bakhmut. Putin is at a loss for words as he fears that the Ukrainian army has retaken control of Bakhmut. On the other hand, Russian forces stationed on Ukrainian territory have surpassed their limit of tolerance for the situation. A large number of Russian soldiers stationed on Ukrainian soil since the beginning of the conflict have recently begun to protest against the present state of affairs. For the past 19 months, Russia has been embroiled in a battle that has had a considerable detrimental impact on both the Russian economy and the Russian military. Vladimir Putin, Russia's president, is aware of the current situation. The Russian economy is deteriorating by the day as a result of rising inflation rates in Russia as well as a decrease in the quantity of foreign currency brought into the country. Despite the fact that Russia's leader, Vladimir Putin, has spent a huge amount of money in the state of treasury in an effort to correct this situation, the film that Putin created has received very poor criticism from Russian critics. Despite Vladimir Putin's assertion that money in the public treasury is not spent, specialist researchers' findings reveal that money in the state treasury is used to combat inflation and meet army requirements. In the early days of the conflict, Russian President Vladimir Putin mistakenly believed he could end the occupation in a matter of weeks and then move on to conquer Kiev, the country's capital. The Russian army, however, was unable to reach the level of success it intended due to the Ukrainian army's tough defense and the help it received from the US and other Western nations. Since the second month of the conflict, the Ukrainian army has received both military and financial backing from Western nations led by the United States. As a result, the Russian army's accomplishments have suffered a serious setback. Despite the fact that Russian President Vladimir Putin threatened Western countries at every opportunity and urged non-intervention in this war, Western leaders ignored Putin's warnings. Putin even played the trump card, on which he has always depended, the energy trump card. Putin's objective when he cut off the flow of natural gas to numerous European countries, most notably Germany, was to strike fear into the hearts of Western politicians. Putin, who had not provided natural gas to Germany in almost 2 weeks, believed that if he did not, Germany would withdraw its support for Ukraine. Germany, on the other side, began providing Ukraine with extra military equipment, support, and natural gas and petroleum energy. This was crucial since one of Russia's most vital sources of income was also one of the army's most important sources. As a result, Putin was forced to resume the gas pipelines flowing to Europe not long after. The important step that was expected from Ukraine has finally occurred. Because of how well the Ukrainian army completed its mission. The Russian Navy, a source of anxiety for Europe, has suffered a serious defeat. The Russian Navy was dealt a catastrophic blow near the port of Sevastopol, and as a result, the balance of the battle altered. As a result of these events, those who took part in the revolt had Putin completely surrounded. With support from nations all over the world, the Ukrainian army started to take effective action in the closing stages of the Ukrainian conflict. The Ukrainian army has been mobilized as a result of the Russian army's withdrawal from particular Ukrainian territory. After the failed coup attempt by Wagner leader Prigozhin, public outrage, and the emergence of an internal conflict prompted Russia to go through a difficult period, the Ukrainian army, acting to increase the pressure, has nearly made it impossible for Russian soldiers to enter the region. This occurs following the attempted coup and the outbreak of an internal war. At this point, the departure of all Wagner troops from the Ukrainian battlefield began to put the region's outnumbered Russian soldiers in a difficult position. The fact that there weren't as many Wagner guys in the situation made it more challenging. The Ukrainian army was able to exert tremendous pressure and successfully execute operations in Adidian, resulting in the capture of aid and ammunition supplies bound for the Russian army. Because aid could not be delivered over Ukrainian territory to the Russian military headquarters and front lines of the conflict, Russian soldiers stationed in this region were unable to meet even the most basic needs, such as finding enough food and ammunition for combat. By conducting simultaneous raids and operations in many of the regions occupied by Russian soldiers at the start of the conflict, the Ukrainian army was able to drive Russian forces out of the region. This allowed the Ukrainian army to turn a bad position for Russian soldiers into an advantage for their side of the fight. Putin, who had lost authority and command of the region, continued to amplify his threats as the days passed, prompting the entire global agenda to retaliate forcefully with a variety of demonstrations. The fact that countries from all over the world are giving help and assistance to Ukraine has elicited a strong reaction from Russian President Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin decided to take a radically different course of action after getting support from Western countries and NATO members. Putin, who ordered the Russian Navy to the Black Sea, began making threats against the countries whose territorial seas are located there. The Ukrainian army has dealt Putin an unfathomable blow, causing the battle to shift to a new location as a result of the Ukrainian army's operations. This would have been the single most damaging event for the Russian Navy to date. The Russian Navy's actions in the Black Sea alarmed a large number of nations. Furthermore, they presented a threat to a large number of commerce ships passing through the Black Sea and engaged in harassment and firing. Both the United States and the European Union were unable to remain silent in the face of the situation and, as a result, took action. The Ukrainian army has already initiated preparations for this maneuver, which, if successful, would radically transform the power balance in the Black Sea. This action will terminate Russian Navy authority in the region, as well as the risks it brings. The Ukrainian intelligence service alerted the Ukrainian General Chief of Staff about the dangerous scenario that had been created after discovering that the Russian Navy had dispatched a considerable number of warships to Sevastopol in order to dock in Ukraine. Following that, the Air Force was activated in accordance with the decisions taken during the key conference attended by top authorities in order to send unmanned combat aircraft from the Black Sea to the Crimean Peninsula and to receive intelligence and images from the region. Senior officials were present at this meeting. After lifting flight, the unmanned combat planes on board reported that they had detected a critical situation. There were no air defense sites belonging to the Russian army anywhere over Crimea, at least not according to the images and information obtained. It was knowledge of such gravity that it would entirely change the battle status quo. Previously, the Russian military had relocated air defense equipment from the Crimean Peninsula to this region in order to safeguard the Bakhmut region from a Ukrainian army airstrike. The critical intelligence triggered swift action by the Ukrainian army, which chose to deploy both the shipment delivered from the United Kingdom and the HIMARS missiles provided from the United States. Furthermore, the Ukrainian intelligence service was able to collect information about the coordinates of Russian vessels moored in the port of Sevastopol by communicating with members of the Crimean Fire Group, a group that is regularly discussed in Crimea. As a result of this condition, the Ukrainian army, which had already begun planning for the operation, wasted no time in acting. The Russian Navy, which was plotting a counterattack on Ukraine, was heading for a bad ending. The Ukrainian military has decided to use Storm Shadow missiles, which have high destructive power and can fly 250 kilometers from the United Kingdom. The Ukrainian army, which was acting in response to an instruction from the General Staff and the Ministry of Defense, was preparing for an airstrike by inputting the coordinates of the Russian Navy warships that were about to attack the port of Sevastopol. In addition, 12 unmanned combat aircraft that were on their way to the area would take off and begin an attack. Following the missile launch, the Ukrainian Air Force, which was in charge of pressing the activation button, caused havoc for the Russian Navy, which had already dropped anchor without being informed of the situation. The Ukrainian army launched Storm Shadow missiles and high-powered Mars rockets at the battleships, which were 3 miles from Sevastopol's port, rendering them inoperable as a result of the strike. The Ukrainian soldiers quickly began causing major damage to the ships. The port of Sevastopol was turned into a raging fire in an instant as a direct result of the missiles they launched. After a huge number of Russian warships were rendered worthless, Russian forces began to retire from this position, unable to respond to the Ukrainian army in any way. However, Ukraine has taken an additional crucial step by deploying the unmanned aerial drones he obtained from the adjoining airport to completely lift the Sevastopol port. This is a huge advancement. He noticed that the Russians had already been evacuated and had fled the area prior to the arrival of unmanned aerial vehicles intended to shoot down the mobilizing Russian forces. These trucks were dispatched to assassinate the Russian soldiers. In addition, when Ukrainian unmanned combat planes detected ships evading missile assaults, they were able to send 2 fleeing warships under the sea. After making this finding, these aircraft immediately launched an attack. When word of the large explosions reached Kremlin, Putin went mad with rage and was left contemplating what to do in light of the current situation. Putin was responsible for the destruction of many of the Russian Navy's most elite battleships, causing the country to lose an important source of military force. The Russian army activated its S-400 air defense systems and sent troops to the region in the aftermath of the incident, but they still suffered substantial losses. Russia has caused millions of dollars in damage, putting it in danger of losing control of the Black Sea. In addition to this incident, Russian people in Crimea were the ones who suffered the most from it. When he advocated for the evacuation of Russian residents to Crimea, Vladimir Putin had a plan in mind. Putin, mindful of the disproportionate number of minorities in Crimea, dispatched a significant number of Russian people to the peninsula to quell any potential uprisings there. He also financially rewarded them and ensured that they had a decent standard of living while they were there. However, many people who were worried and scared as a result of these events took steps to return to Russia, believing that there was no longer any hope of surviving there in any manner. The issue of Russians who have created huge lineups at the Russian border has been on the agendas of governments all around the world. Numerous people have expressed their objection to the continuation of this conflict. Russians and the Kremlin reacted angrily to Putin's statements, stating that they no longer wanted to lose their lives as a result of his flaws and failures. War experts believe that the Ukrainian army has the potential to maintain its lead in a variety of fields. With this most recent operation, the Ukrainian army, which was already substantially superior to the Russian force on land, quickly established an edge at sea. This was a huge step forward. Putin, who is principally responsible for Russia's current situation, has gradually begun to take steps to absolve himself of blame for the country's current situation. However, if current trends continue, the Ukrainian army will be able to achieve a decisive win over the Russians in a relatively short period of time. It's just a matter of time. And if Ukraine wins this struggle, Vladimir Putin is largely expected to step down in the near future. A death within Russian borders has been ascribed to the death of one of Vladimir Putin's most committed generals. The Ukrainian army's assassination of Russian General Viktor Yeltsin has become a hot topic of discussion on agendas all over the world. Following the publication on the Telegram channel of the identity photo of Russian General Viktor Yeltsin, whose Ukrainian fighters had ambushed, there was significant alarm within the Kremlin palace. The Russian government, led by Vladimir Putin, is preparing to deploy its armed forces in the Belgorod region. It was widely assumed that the confrontation between Russia and Ukraine, which has been ongoing for several months at this point, would continue indefinitely within Ukraine's borders. However, over the last 3 months, the activities and ground operations carried out by the Ukrainian army across Russia's borders have begun to worry Russian President Vladimir Putin. Soldiers from the pro-Ukrainian Russian Legion of Freedom crossed the border into Belgorod a few months ago and set up camp before launching a series of attacks on Russian forces. As a result of these activities, the Legion of Freedom troops were successful in forcing Russian forces away from their territory. These men were also successful in seizing 4 other Russian towns in Belgorod. Vladimir Putin, Russia's president, has tasked Russian General Viktor Yeltsin with re-establishing power in the Belgorod region and has expelled members of the Legion of Freedom from the country. Valery Gerasimov, the commander of the Russian General Staff, did not agree with Viktor Yeltsin's proposal to oversee this mission remotely and instead instructed Yeltsin to report directly to the front lines of the fight. Yeltsin's plan to manage this mission remotely was rejected. Yeltsin, on the other hand, was the one who ultimately paid the price for Gerasimov's choice as she passed away. Pro-Ukrainian soldiers who are members of the Russian Legion of Freedom have started attacking Russian soldiers who are stationed in towns inside Russia's borders during the past few weeks. These assaults were carried out with the intention of targeting members of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. Legion of Freedom fighters have become Vladimir Putin's biggest nightmare because they conceal their identities by wearing stolen Russian military uniforms. This is because Legion of Freedom soldiers mask their identities by donning stolen Russian military uniforms. After seizing the armament caches along the border that belonged to the Russian army, members of the Legion of Freedom shared every stage of their operation on Telegram channels. General Valery Gerasimov of the Russian Armed Forces has stated on many occasions that militants with the Legion of Freedom are juveniles who will be pushed into returning. Legion of Freedom militants will be forced to return to Russia. Despite the fact that Gerasimov's proclamation was made some months ago, Legion of Freedom troops are continuing to make progress within Russia. After the Legion of Freedom took control of Ukrainian border towns close to Belgorod, the Ukrainian army and the Legion of Freedom collaborated closely and enjoyed a great deal of success as a result of their combined efforts. General Viktor Yeltsin organized an expedition to identify and plan the Legion of Freedom unit after being tasked with the mission by Russian General Gerasimov, who had sent Yeltsin to Belgorod. Yeltsin, a general serving the Russian Empire, had the objective of recapturing the towns of Kazinka, Graver, and Legion of Freedom. In order to retake control of each of these settlements, General Yeltsin and his army planned to launch simultaneous assaults on both of them. The Russian General Yeltsin was unsuccessful in his attempts to avoid being ambushed. The particulars were extremely important for Viktor Yeltsin to consider when organizing this operation. These soldiers who support Ukraine may have been stationed in another location instead. In order to ensure the success of this operation, Yeltsin planned to initiate the process by organizing an expedition in the region. General Yeltsin led a group of 14 Russian soldiers and a large number of armored vehicles in the direction of the regions that were close to the towns that were taken by the pro-Ukrainian Legion of Freedom. Scout battalions were stationed in the area around the communities that the Legion of Freedom had just taken control of in order to ensure their safety. The scout soldiers promptly reported to their superiors the presence of Russian armored tanks when they became aware of their approach. The Legion of Freedom quickly devised a plan to ambush the Russian armored vehicles as they traveled along the road. After a moment of inactivity, Russian General Viktor Yeltsin and his troops moved forward toward the ambush spot. Armed vehicles belonging to the Russian military were caught in the crossfire between the Legion of Freedom and the Russian army. Despite the fact that they had been firing for several minutes, the Ukrainian army was able to wipe out the Russians in a matter of seconds. The commander of the Legion of Freedom Union, who was responsible for organizing the assault, pushed for the implementation of vehicle checks. Soldiers loyal to the pro-Ukrainian faction had reason to think that the vehicles had been used to carry Russian forces. One name stuck out and grabbed notice when the identification cards of the troops who had been slain in the trucks were reviewed. soldiers from Ukraine revealed the truth about the identity of the Russian general, Viktor Yeltsin. The fact that Russian General Yeltsin took off his shoulder pads raised some eyebrows, leading some to question his rank. On the other hand, his identification card disclosed the high standing he held in the Russian armed forces. The 58th Russian Rifle Brigade was under Yeltsin's command. Yeltsin's death was one of Putin's personal trophies for service, but Gerasimov, the chief of the Russian General Staff, gave approval for the instructions that led to Yeltsin's death. Things took a turn for the worse when the warriors from the Legion of Freedom, who were in charge of the operation, uploaded a photo of Russian General Viktor Yeltsin's identification card onto the messaging app Telegram. This event was brought up in conversation in a number of countries, with Russia being the most prominent among them. It was this particular incident that drove Russian President Vladimir Putin to the point of utter fury. Putin was furious that a senior army official had been killed in Russia, despite the fact that he was ignorant that Russian General Yeltsin had been sent to Belgorod. Putin did not know that Yeltsin had been sent to Belgorod. General Yeltsin was on a mission in Belgorod, but Putin was not aware of it. Putin is interested in having high-profile meetings as soon as possible, and some of the people he wants to meet with include the head of Russian intelligence, Sergei Naryshkin, the chairman of the General Staff, Gerasimov, and Defense Minister Shoigu. Officials within the Kremlin claim that Vladimir Putin gave a furious response to Sergei Naryshkin and General Gerasimov. Gerasimov's selection infuriated Putin, but he was unsure of why. In spite of the fact that he was clueless, he was of the opinion that Sergei Naryshkin, the chief of the intelligence service, was more responsible for what had occurred. Sergei Naryshkin is rumored to have been reprimanded by Putin for allegedly remarking that the pro-Ukrainian Legion of Freedom warriors who had been on Russian territory for months were not closely monitored and that the Russian intelligence service was not working hard enough. Putin is believed to have stated that the Russian intelligence service was not working hard enough. Putin, the leader of Russia, blamed Gerasimov, the chief of the General Staff, for the killing of the general. Putin was a member of the Russian intelligence service, Naryshkin. The ineffectiveness of the Russian intelligence organization has drawn a lot of criticism. This issue has received a lot of attention from Russian General Sergei Surovikin, who just took command of the Russian armed forces, and has underlined it quite a bit. The Ukrainian military was carrying out airstrikes against the Russian military, which resulted in a significant number of casualties. It was Dmitry. On the other hand, Vladimir Putin pointed the finger of blame at Sergei Surovikin for the defeat. Soon after that, Vladimir Putin dismissed Sergei Surovikin from his position. Surovikin made a statement prior to his termination, but it is unclear whether or not it had any impact on Putin. It has been asserted that the Russian intelligence service is incompetent. General Surovikin of the Russian army asserts that the Ukrainian intelligence service used numerous soldiers on Ukrainian territory who had received specialized training to find Russian army headquarters and ammunition stockpiles. The Ukrainian intelligence service reported both of these feats. Surovikin is of the opinion that members of the Russian intelligence service stationed in Ukraine are unable to operate in this manner. Shortly after that, Surovikin was relieved of his duties, and he blamed Russian intelligence chief Sergei Naryshkin for these activities, which were led by the Ukrainian army. Surovikin is suspected of hatching a plot to stage a coup. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the commander of the Wagner organization, allegedly attempted to stage a coup in Russia before he passed away. It is believed that Surovikin provided assistance